when the office of deacon was opened, there were many arguments that were brought forward. And I thought I'd talk about some of those arguments and really ask the question, are the arguments in favor of women serving as deacons persuasive? And so that's what I want to do today. And already, I don't think I'm going to get through everything I have here, but because the office of deacon is particularly different than that of elders and pastors, some believe that it should be opened. So I thought I'd go through some of those arguments. One, and this is a big one, is the case of Phoebe. And so that's found in Romans 16, verse 1, where Paul says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church in Kentria. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Centria or Kentria. But the word servant in the Greek language is diakonos. Diakonos. And that also is the word for deacon, for what we would know as the term deacon. In other words, the question that we need to ask whenever we're reading Scripture, there's sort of an exegetical or hermeneutical question. When diakonos is used, we need to determine whether it is referring to the office of deacon, or is it just speaking about, is it speaking about maybe the functional actions or even a quality of a particular person? And I think we can understand that difference. But the hardship is that the same word is used for both of those. In other words, let me put it this way, it's normal for Christians in the church to serve. But not all Christians are deacons. But in the Greek, if I said that you're a good servant in the church, it would say diakonos. That's what it would say, And so how do you distinguish, right? And all deacons are servants, but not all servants are deacons. Not all who serve are deacons. So when diakonos is applied to a person, how are we to tell if it is the office of deacon or if it is just simply referring to this person's service in the church? Do you understand that the functions, what they are doing functionally in the church, or even their quality? When I say their quality, I'm saying this person has a servant heart. That's kind of they're just a servant, right? And I think we get that. We could probably in our mind, if I say, think about who is a servant in the church, your mind probably goes to somebody. And now my question is, that person that your mind goes to, is that person a deacon? Okay? And that's the distinction we want to make sure that we're aware of. So how do you determine that? You look at the context. That's an important hermeneutical point, as you look at the context. In 2 Corinthians 6, verse 4, Paul is writing to the Corinthian church, and he says, but as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way. So Paul there is referring to himself as a servant, diakonos. Okay? He applies diakonos to himself. So then we ask the question, well, is Paul talking about an office, the office of deacon, or is he just talking about the function, how he functions? And I think the answer to that is very clear. Paul was never ordained to the office of deacon. He was an apostle. So he's not talking of himself as an office bearer that is a deacon. He is just saying, we commend ourselves as servants to you. Right? And so just that we see that difference, and the usage here is clearly functional with no reference to the office. Okay? So I want to make sure that it's clear. And what I would argue is that the New Testament scriptures normally use diakonos in that functional sense, not in the official sense, not as office bearers. It normally uses diakonos in that functional sense, without reference to the biblical office of deacons. So let me give some examples of that. In Matthew 20:26, Jesus says, "Whoever would be great among you must be your servant." Okay, so now what is Jesus saying? Mark 9:34, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." Well, I think all of us would know that Jesus, and he's using the word diakonos, that Jesus is not saying that they need to serve as office bearers, right? I mean, I think we all would recognize that. That's not what Jesus is saying there in the context. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. He's not saying they need to serve in the office of deacon. That's not what he's saying. Or if anyone will be first, he must be last of all and a servant of all. So clearly, Jesus is just saying there's a servant attitude that should typify those who are leaders. That's what he's saying. He's not there talking about the diaconate as an office. In Romans 13, that's a passage that we know well. It says this, verses 3 and 4, rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. And would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. And so the question then, if we ask the question, well, what is that saying? Is Paul there in Romans 13 saying that the public official is a deacon? No. Not holding an office of a deacon, but he is a servant. Okay, that's very clear. And so the context helps us to figure it out. Christ himself, who certainly did not receive the office of deacon in the church, he said, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, diakonos, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Clearly, Jesus wasn't referring to himself in the office of deacon. So there's a distinction. And then Paul says of Epaphras in Colossians 1:7, who was a church planter and a founder of the church of Colossae, just as you learned it from Epaphras, our beloved fellow servant. Again, Epaphras was not a deacon and holding the office of deacon. He was a servant. My point is, when diakonos is used in the New Testament, the normal usage of it is to simply express somebody's functioning as a servant in the church and is not referring to the office of deacon. When the New Testament speaks about diakonos as an office, it's very clear in the context. Okay? Like Acts chapter 6. Where the office of deacon is instituted. That's very clear. Okay, that's or 1 Timothy chapter 3, where it talks about the qualifications for elders, and then it says, likewise you deacons, and goes in and makes qualifications. It's very clear that that's referring to an office, the office of deacon in the church. But there aren't many other places, actually, where that is brought out. So the question then is, was Phoebe a deacon, an office bearer as a deacon in the church at that time? And so one would need to demonstrate then in Romans 16 verse 1 that diakonos there is used as a title as well as a title of office, as well as sort of her ministry function in the church. And is there such evidence? And the answer is no. There's no evidence that this is a title of office for Phoebe. So my point is that Phoebe is often used as an example of a deaconess in the church. But they just took that verse. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant, diakonos, of the church in Kentria, in Romans 16, verse 1. I would simply say that is a reference to how she has been functioning in the church. She's a servant. She has a servant heart. She's engaged in the church and giving of her time and efforts in the church, and I commend her to you. That I think is what Paul is clearly saying. It is not saying that there's no indication that she holds the office of deaconess. So it refers to her service in the church. And I would say, and probably her character as a person. She's a servant, has a servant's heart. But that's one of the arguments that is brought for women deacons is Phoebe. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Is it instructive that in Acts chapter 7, actually the word deacon is not used, specifically in the laying on of hands?
In Acts 6?
It seems like what they stress is that it was the laying on of hands that was critical, and then it wasn't one-on-one. When Timothy and like in Philippians it refers to bishops and deacons.
Yeah.
There's a clear implication we're talking about an office upon which someone has had
That's clearly right. That's where you look at the context and you say, okay, that's what is being pointed out, is the laying on of hands is what makes that distinction. And so you do have that in Acts chapter 6. And then again, in other passages, as you mentioned, and first again for Timothy chapter 3, where likewise the deacons, so you have the elders, and then likewise the deacons, and that's the clear context is they're in an office, which includes the laying on of hands. So that's correct. That's right. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, then the next argument is the argument of authority. Okay, and this is one actually where I had to work through early on, trying to figure this question out about the office of deacon. May a woman serve in the office of deacon? And again, in 1984, the CRC opened up this office to women with these arguments. And those in favor of including women to be deacons in the church say that the office of deacon is not a ruling office. So in that sense, it doesn't have ruling authority. And one could argue and say, well, as far as that goes, that's true. In other words, the elders are given the responsibility of rule and have that ruling authority in the church. So as far as that goes, that's true. But that does not mean that the office of deacon contains no authority whatsoever. Excuse me. The deacons are rightly under the oversight of the elders, since the elders have oversight over the entire church and congregation. But it still has authority within the domain of its service. Okay? And so if somebody were to come to the church and say that, they need money for gas, okay? That person would be referred to the deacons, and the deacons don't need to wait until the next council meeting to get permission to give this person money for gas. They have that authority to do that themselves, because that's within the realm of what they do, or one of the things that they do. They have that authority. They don't have to seek permission to help somebody out in that way. Now, obviously, the deacons need to be wise and maybe go with that person to the gas station and fill up their tank and pay for it, and then make sure that they actually buy gas and not drugs or alcohol or something like that, right? And so the deacons need to be wise in that regard. But they have the authority to deal with that, and in fact, that's one of the reasons they're deacons. That's their responsibility. That's your deal. And so they have authority, is my point. It's just authority within the context of deacons. In other words, and in fact, you could say the idea of office apart from authority is actually ludicrous. It doesn't make sense. It's kind of absurd. The very concept of office implies that there is some authority, some kind of authority. Otherwise, there's no reason to have an office, if you understand what I'm saying. So to ordain women to an office is therefore to establish her in a position of some authority. Is why the URC has said that the offices of deacon as well as elder and pastor are restricted to men, and then of course not to every man, but to those who are qualified. Okay, but there is some authority in the office of deacon. It's not a ruling authority, but they still have an authority within the bound of their service as deacons. Any question there? Okay. Now those arguments, by the way, the question of authority and the Phoebe one are big. They're big arguments for women in the office of deacon. There's also the argument. This one is very interesting in 1 Timothy 3, where it talks about deacons and elders, but also deacons being husbands of one wife. And so, okay, well, that kind of, and at least in my mind, it's like that would indicate that they're talking about men, that they're husbands of one wife. But the argument that's brought out by those in favor of opening the office of deacon to women would say that that husband is not really gender specific. In the same way that man is not always gender specific. And okay, we grant that. And they would even say in the same way that brethren, when Paul might speak, to the brethren, that he's talking about the church generally, and it's not gender specific. So these can refer to women as well as men. As I think about that argument, it just seems to me to be very coerced, if I may put it that way. It's really pressing something that isn't very obvious there, because there are times where man actually does mean males, and most times there are times where brethren or brothers actually does mean males, and in fact most times, and husband means a married man, and wife means a married woman, and that's what it means. And then when you think about that in 1 Timothy 3, and then remember what Paul says in 1 Timothy 2, where he says that I do not allow women to speak or have authority over man. It seems clear, given to what Paul says in that immediate context, that the roles of elder and deacon in chapter 3 refers to the male gender. And then, and let me just say this, and actually this I am finishing. I'm going quickly, I know, but I am finishing. Is that for the Reformed churches anyway, for over 400 years, recognize that Scriptures calls men to serve in the offices, the three offices of the church, deacons and elders and pastor, and for the reasons that I've been giving above. Now, if that is wrong, then we rightly should change that, right? If that is wrong and unbiblical, then we rightly should change that. Now, I don't believe it is. I think the Scripture is actually pretty clear on the matter. But I would certainly say that the burden of proof resides on those who disagree. The burden of proof resides on those who would open up the offices. And I don't believe that they have brought sufficient proof biblically to do so. And I don't think they can. I think the Bible is very clear. And that's where the URC has stood. And so I wanted to just take this time, just focusing on the office of deacon, because that's usually where the Pandora's box gets opened. and then it's usually not too long before the other offices get opened as well. So.